I wanted to just give you a brief Flashpoint update. Flashpoint updates are connected to what we call Geoprophecy events, hotspots in the world that may have prophetic implications for the future. And so there's a lot going on, obviously, as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. And I wanted to take just a couple minutes to kind of bring you up to date on some of the things that I am seeing and hearing. I do subscribe to some intelligence reports, and I had a very interesting one that came across the wire this morning. And so I wasn't really planning to do this, but I thought you would find it interesting in terms of some of the things that are going on over there. I caution you, as I think internally as well, as I'm looking at what is going on in the world, that you are discerning. As you're watching the news media, as you're seeing information come across the wires, make sure that you are discerning. Anytime you see all of the news media outlets all pushing in one direction with a unified message, your radar should go off. We've seen this over the past couple of years, in particular with COVID and some of the agendas that are at work. There are far more things at play that are happening behind the scenes than we even can imagine. There is not one singular issue that is at play. There are many things, and there are multiple layers to all of this. So I in no sense claim to have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but I just want to call to your attention some of the things that are transpiring so that it may help you as you're watching and listening carefully to what is taking place over there. Obviously, what is happening in Ukraine is an absolute disaster. The humanitarian toll is huge. You know, when we talk about numbers, I always remind myself as I'm studying and thinking through these things, as I remind you, that we're talking about lives, that these are people. And I think I had mentioned a week or two ago that except for the grace of God, we would be in the same situation. So we have much to be thankful for, but we must be praying for these people in harm's way in this part of the world. It's a very, very difficult situation, and it rips at your heart when you see some of the things that are taking place. In the same vein, I caution you to not necessarily believe everything that your eyes see. When wars are being fought, particularly in recent days, but throughout history, and now more so with social media and the ability to see things, wars are in large measure fought for the attitudes and the minds of the public at large. So it is very important when you're seeing things that you understand. Now, I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Russia is not responsible for what it's doing. I'm not saying that Putin is a good guy. Obviously, there are terrible things that are taking place that they bear responsibility for. But I also want you to look at things with a balanced perspective. And that having balance doesn't necessarily mean you're going soft. I think as a conservative, I'm a conservative person. When I look at things and I say, well, I have to look at things in a balanced perspective. Having balance doesn't necessarily mean that you're going soft or that you don't think people who are perpetrating things should pay a penalty or the appropriate penalty. But I also know that it's important when you look at things to see things in a balanced perspective. And in the news media, very rarely do we get authentic balance in what is taking place. And I don't claim to have the answers, and I don't know all the issues taking place behind the scenes. But I just caution you that as you're seeing things on television, that you ask yourself questions before you just jump all in. I don't think that Russia is portraying things accurately, but I also have big question marks about whether the West is portraying things accurately too, in terms of some of the things that are going on, some of the atrocities that they're calling to our attention, images that are being trotted out on television. Very, very important to look carefully at these things. I want to share a little bit of a perspective with you from maybe what the Russian perspective may be. And again, there are bigger issues at play. There is a bigger agenda at work. When the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, broke apart, Russia itself stayed as the main entity. But you had a lot of these satellite nations, which are part of Eastern Europe, that essentially broke away from the power and the authority that was used to control them from the former Soviet Union, from Russia. So you had places like Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and Romania and Hungary and now the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. A lot of these places where they have individual names for their countries, but the Soviet Union really held sway over them, controlled them in large measure. And when the Soviet Union broke apart and the former Soviet republics to the south of what is Russia today, which many of them are Islamic, they gained their independence in large measure, and these satellite nations also gained their independence. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of which the United States and much of Europe is connected, is a military alliance, and it purports to be defensive in nature. However, if you're looking at it from a Russian perspective, and again, this is not to justify a war that we're seeing taking place, but it gives you a little more framework by which maybe Putin and the Russians are looking at this, is that NATO, which was intended and purports to be a defensive military position, has been pushing NATO for these satellite nations that used to be under the domain of the Soviet Union. NATO is now moving into those nations, and those are becoming NATO allies or NATO countries, which means that all of the rules of NATO apply, and we have been moving troops into those places. Europe has been moving troops, supplies, military assets, and all of those things are moving ever closer to Russia. So when you look at a map and you see all of those countries that were part of the Soviet Union's domain now moving into the NATO domain, and you see missile systems and other things being moved in militarily, Russia perceives this as an aggression. Again, not justification, but they see it as aggression. So first, you have to understand that's the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's what's been happening steadily ever since. Now, in recent days and recent years, there has been a lot of talk about Ukraine becoming part of NATO. That would put NATO literally on Russia's doorstep. And with Ukraine being a NATO ally and nation, that would allow NATO, America, Europe, and the West to move more military assets even closer to Russia's doorstep. Now, you may have heard in the news as well about biological chemical laboratories that Russia is claiming that they have uncovered along their border with Ukraine, and that America and the West and Europe are funding these biological and chemical laboratories. What the truth is, it's impossible for us to know because we're hearing things from both sides in terms of what is taking place. Obviously, I would love to believe our military. I would love to believe the Pentagon. I would love to believe what the United States is saying. It's my country and I love it. But it's hard to know where the reality is when you're talking about things related to these biological labs. There was another incident that took place in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol, where you had a women's and children's facility. It's been in the news in the last 24 hours, where the West is claiming that Russia bombed it, and then there are pictures of women and children with blood on their faces coming out. I tend to believe that that's the reality. But if you listen to what other sides are saying and other positions on this, is that all things are not as you're seeing in the news media. I don't know what the reality is and what the truth is. I'm just cautioning you to be wary of the things that you're seeing and to use discernment when you're looking at them. Now, there's another reason why I tell you all this, and that is because what we are seeing in a global sense is we are seeing a decoupling You may have heard that word being used during the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years. There is a decoupling taking place between the United States and the West with China. There is a separation taking place economically, technologically. One of the implications of that we're seeing is supply chain disruptions. The world and globalization the idea of globalization has moved the world into a tangled web of supply chain related issues in terms of technology and the economy and just trade in general. What is happening is that supply chains are moving from global in nature to regional in nature. There is a regionalization taking place within the world. And the goal, and it's becoming more obvious as we go along, is to move supply chains to a closer proximity to where the end product will be delivered to the consumer. That means bringing back things that are manufactured maybe in China and having them maybe manufactured in Mexico for a North American clientele, consumer. That is happening all around the world. So knowing that that is taking place and knowing that there is a decoupling that is taking place, I ask the question, why? It is very possible that the reason is because China is on such an ascendant trajectory that the United States, Europe, and the West in general understands that China will not be able to be suppressed forever, and China is rising. Now, I'm not saying it's a good situation. China is run by authoritarian communistic regime. But nonetheless, they are rising, and they are rising at the expense of the West and the United States. And as China is rising, there is a concern about the reserve currency of the world. What is the money denomination that is being used? What is the currency that is being used in the world? Right now, 55 to 59% of trade economically within the world is used, they use US dollars. US dollars. We have a huge benefit accrued to us as Americans because much of the world conducts transactions in US dollars. But as China rises, China has a very small percentage, about 2 or 3% of everything that is done globally in terms of trade. Do they use their renminbi, which is the Chinese currency, or sometimes you hear the yuan. But China is looking to expand the use of their currency in world global affairs and in trade. And there is a lot of intelligent people who believe that within the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, that China's percentage of trade taking place using Chinese currency will go from 2% up to maybe 7 or 8% of the world. That's a large number, a large shift in a very short amount of time. So it is possible that the West, and particularly the United States, is very concerned about losing its status as the world's reserve currency. Already, Russia and China signed an agreement, I believe it was in 2019, to conduct transactions between Russia and China in their own currency and not using dollars in the transactions. And there's been a lot of talk within the petroleum producing countries of the Middle East for a push to use other currencies, not the dollar. That diminishes America and our power in the globe and our influence in the globe when those things happen. So now you flash forward to what is taking place between Russia and Ukraine. Have you noticed that many Western companies have announced that they are no longer going to be doing business in Russia? There was tremendous pressure put on McDonald's, who has 700 or 800 restaurants in Russia, from what I understand, to close them. There is also public pressure being put on Marriott and other corporations that are doing business in Russia, and many others have already announced that we will no longer do business in Russia. Russia, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard about cancel culture. This is cancel country. What is happening from Europe and the United States is essentially canceling Russia. And they're saying, we're punishing you because of what you're doing in Ukraine, and using that as justification. I would suggest to you that the move to separate Russia from the world's economic system, particularly as it relates to the West, to Europe and to the United States, has been happening for some time, even since before Crimea, when Russia went into Crimea back in 2014. So be careful when you're seeing these wars or these conflicts to take everything at face value, because there is an agenda at work behind the scenes, and I would suspect, and I do suspect, that a large portion of what we're seeing was already in the works before the conflict started, and that the United States and Europe are essentially decoupling their economic components, their connectivity with Russia. Now, what does this mean? What are the implications of this? Because if Russia right now is so isolated on the world stage, they're looking for allies and friends. Well, China is playing it coy behind the scenes because China desperately needs the wheat and the oil that Russia produces. China needs those things. So China is not going to come out publicly and say very much negative about what is happening in Russia, because most likely Russia is going to fall into the Chinese orbit. Back to power and influence in the world. The United States, the world has really had one policeman for many years now, since the world wars. And that is the United States, the world's policeman, and has the power and influence because of our economic strength and because of our reserve currency status. We have a lot of influence on what happens in the rest of the world, and because of a strong military. So the world has been a unipolar place, one entity really having dominion over the world in large measure. The world is changing into a bipolar globe. This may be connected to the whole concept of the global reset, which goes much deeper than this, and that is a strong America, a strong China, bipolar world. And the nations that will fall into their supply chains fall into their orbit, and therefore the nations that fall into Chinese orbit will conduct trade and economics in the currency of China, and the same would be true for the United States and those nations that fall within our orbit. There are others who believe that the world is going to be divided up into many more components, many more regions, and that it'll be not just a bipolar world, it'll be a multipolar world, so that Europe may have its own regionalization, North America has its own, another one in Asia, a Chinese one, and maybe a Russian, and then the concern is, will Russia and rogue nations like Iran and potentially China, will they all unify? So that is a big concern for the West. So I caution you, and I wanted to share these things with you so you can think in a more broad and discerning way and not be so focused on the specifics of what the news media is putting in front of your face that you don't think in a much bigger way. I will tell you one other thing, and that is that Russia and Ukraine were having peace talks in Turkey just recently. And you know, if you've come to these classes, you know that we believe biblically that Turkey will play a very significant role in the last days. Turkey was hosting peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. They ended, and there was a stalemate, and there was no agreement. And now, would you believe that Israel is in the mix, and that Israel, according to intelligence reports, are saying that they would like to host the next round of peace talks because Israel wants to bolster its diplomacy and its diplomatic reputation in the world. As a matter of fact, I was just reading that the Prime Minister of Israel went to Russia just recently, and that Israel is looking to play the role of arbiter in terms of what is going on between Russia and Ukraine. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. All of these things are moving us ever closer to the last days and the end of the age. We can't set dates, but we do need to be aware of what is going on as believers so that we can be informed and prepared to give an answer when we talk to those around us, ultimately with the purpose to share our faith in Jesus Christ.